Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to this Zoom webinar or over Facebook Live. My name is Sophia Perez, and I'm the Program Officer for the Northern Marianas Humanities Council. So October is Humanities Month here in the CNMI, and we at the Humanities Council have been celebrating by holding 2 Zoom webinars every Friday of the month at 10 a.m. and 5 p.m., each featuring a different humanities topic. This afternoon, we are joined by Arielle Lowe, who will be presenting about her experience as a Chamaole born and raised on Guam, as well as sharing her findings on the experiences of 3 other Chamaoles, poets actually, coming from a similar background. So Arielle, thank you so much for being here this morning.
Thank you. Buenas and half day, everyone who is tuning in. Thank you for attending my presentation. So today I will be sharing the findings of my research project titled Pakaka Pachot-mu, Chamorro, an analysis of Guam's Chamaole narratives.
And before we begin, if it's all right, Ariel, I'd love to just cut in really quick with a little bit of housekeeping.
Yes.
So just a quick note for anyone listening, these events are supported in part by the National Endowment for the Humanities, and any opinions or conclusions presented during Humanities Friday's presentations do not necessarily reflect the perspective of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Also, please hold any questions until the last 15 minutes of the presentation. We will have a question and answer period. And if you would like to ask your question and have your face actually show in the webinar, please just send me a quick note in the chat. I can totally do that. Or you can just type it out, and as moderator, I can read Ariel your questions. So yeah, there's another webinar also at 5 p.m. today, just for anyone who is enjoying this, who wants to keep educating themselves in honor of Humanities Month. Please tune in also at 5 p.m. I think that about does it for me. So Ariel, thanks again for being here, and please go ahead.
All right, thank you so much. So here's a quick flyer from my defense last year, and it has some pictures of my participants. So for those of us who are not totally familiar, what is Chamaole? What is the Chamaole identity? What does the word mean? So Chamaole is a local term used to refer to individuals who are descendants of both white Americans and Chamorros. The word itself is coming from the root words Chamorro and Haole, right? So Chamorro being the name of our native people, indigenous to Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands, and Haole, which is actually borrowed from Hawaiian, Haole, which means white American foreigner or settler on the island. Simply put, Chamorros from Guam married and had children with white Americans for a variety of reasons, including romance. Here I have some photos. This is my paternal grandmother, Aurora Sablan. She married my paternal grandfather, Gordon Lowe, and these are their kids. On my mom's side, my great-grandma, Juana Benner, she married, well, first she married John Benner and then remarried my grandpa, Robert Manahan, and they had children. So I am actually mixed on both sides of my family. And here are Rita's grandkids, and that's my mom on the upper right-hand side. And so the children of these families, born and raised on Guam, would come to have a new racial identity. And in this presentation, I will talk a little bit about what exactly a race-based identity means. We also call this mestizo or mestiza in the Chamorro language, borrowed from Spanish, meaning of mixed Chamorro ancestry. And so the way my grandparents use mestizo and mestiza, it can mean any mixed person. Mestiza Americana, mestizo Americano are alternative words to refer to Chamaole, but my generation, Chamaole is the most popular. From my own experiences personally, right, I knew that being Chamaole can come with a set of unique social challenges in Guam and identity crises, such as, why do I look this way? Why do I feel this way? Why am I experiencing these these specific things in my social world, questions that come from not having a full sense of belonging into either of these two worlds, right? We're thinking, okay, this is a Chamorro world, born and raised on Guam, but there's also this Haole, or this American world, that I also feel like I don't belong to. And so as I tried to answer some of these questions, I actually came across a theorist, and her name is Gloria Anzaldúa. And so her work helped me best understand what it means to be mixed race, indigenous, and white identities, and what kind of unique conflicts that could produce in the way someone experiences their world. And so Anzaldúa is most known for what she calls mestiza consciousness, right? You know, in Chamorro, we use this word. We use mestiza and mestizu to mean mixed. And so Anzaldúa came up with this theory that coming from a mixed background, especially unique to her context, indigenous and white European American, comes with a unique way of thinking. And so I'll talk a little bit more about this. But her key text is called Borderlands, and the main story that she tries to convey is that being in between, coming from two or more different cultures and societies that have historically clashed with one another, can actually enable you to create a new consciousness, a new way of thinking that can go beyond these boundaries. And I'll talk more about this, but before I do, I had some central research questions. My first question: what identities do Chamaoles inhabit simultaneously, right? So if being Chamaole means Chamorro and Haole, what does it mean to be Chamorro? What does it mean to be Haole in our world today? My second research question: what specific identity ambiguity encounters do Chamaoles face? And so another way of asking this question is, why is the Chamaole experience so confusing? What are some of the confusing things that a Chamaole from Guam might experience? And so my third question: what strategies would help Chamaoles reconstruct their identity in positive ways, right? From my own experience, question 2, right? Why is being Chamaole so confusing? Those feelings of confusion growing up were uncomfortable, painful. And so I wanted to know, okay, what are some ways to think about my identity that's positive, that's empowering, that is healing in a lot of ways? And so hopefully for those of you tuning in, if you have any questions about this, feel free to talk to me anytime. I'm all about helping others kind of learn some of these tools that we can use to better understand ourselves. And for my project, I actually did 2 different things. So as an English major, traditionally, you think of like high school English, right? You're given a poem by Shakespeare and you interpret the poem. And so that's the bread and butter, or the tatizas and butter of English literature. And so I thought, okay, I want to write about my experience being Chamaole. And I read Anzaldúa. And then I actually came across the very first poem I had ever read and ever seen that talked about an experience of being Chamaole. And I read it and I thought, wow, that's a story I recognize. Like that's also my story, right? In a way. And so here on the left, Half Caste by Jessica Perez Jackson. This was published in Storyboard 13 coming out of the University of Guam. And so Jessica's poem talks about her being from Inarajan and being nicknamed 75 cents. because one of her parents had a mixed identity of being Chamorro and white, and so that was her nickname for her basketball team at Inarahan Middle School. Next, I found another poem titled Chamaole by Corey Santos, which is found in the Local Voices anthology. And lastly, I found a whole poetry book. Sorry, let me go back. So this is A Bell Made of Stones, written by Leifula Taitino. So it's a full-length poetry book. But for this project, I just looked at 3 poems: Sisters, Maps, and Hyphenation. So these 3 texts are the resources that I found, written and published stories about being Chamaole from Guam. And at the time that I found these poems, I was already working on my bachelor's degree at the University of Guam. So when I found these, I thought to myself, dang, like, what if I found these poems earlier? And so that's what kind of helped motivate this project. Here are some excerpts. So from Half-Caste, Chamaole and A Bell Made of Stones. Half-caste, and I'm not even half, a quarter, but in high school I was called 75 cents. A term of endearment maybe, not meant to be offensive, you haole. Chamaole by Corey Santos. White boy? Leche Pakaka Pachot-mu. As my fist connected with his chin, I could have sworn we had the same skin tone. My dad's Chamorro. Yeah, but you're still white. What the heck did that mean? I was 9. And last from A Bell Made of Stones. This guy down at the corner store looks at my ID, then my ID, says, hey, you don't look like your average white person. What are you supposed to say to that? Not white enough, not brown enough. You know what Uncle Jesse calls us? It's kind of funny. It's Chamaoles. Half Chamorro, half Haoles. Who even knows which one is which, right? And so these were really, really violent experiences, right? That these writers had experienced. And so coming across it in the written text, I was like, wow, okay, this is some real stuff, right? People are writing about this. And so moving forward, this all looks fancy, but these are just some other scholars that I read, some other books that I came across, and I was like, okay, so I read these poems and I read about these people, but like, I want to talk to these people. Like, you know, we live, most of us live in Guam. How often do we get to talk to writers? And I actually had to ask my advisor, am I allowed to do this? Like, am I allowed to interview these poets for my project? And so to justify interviewing these really fantastic people, I actually modeled after the text here on the right, One Half is Whole by Stephen Murphy Shigematsu. And so this particular researcher, he wrote about his personal experience being Asian American, being Japanese and Irish American, and he interviewed 9 other people. And I used some of those ideas for this project. And I met some very, very awesome writers. So from left to right, on the left, this is Jessica Harris Jackson, Corey Santos in the middle, and Leifula Taitino on the right. And so going back to Ansel Dua, she, another scholar named Andrea Lunsford, studied Ansel Dua to talk about unique ways to conduct research, right? Coming from that indigenous perspective. And so this kind of research, like, it welcomes using your native language. So this means that for my research, I could write in the Chamorro language. I can write about my own experiences. Sometimes they're traditionally, there's kind of this story floating around that, oh, as a researcher, I shouldn't be writing about myself. But actually, you know, coming from the Pacific Islands and, you know, our families, right? We're always sharing stories or talking about ourselves and our families. And so because of this scholar, Andrea Lunsford and Anzaldua, I realized, okay, I can talk about my family. I can interview these poets. I don't have to treat them like Shakespeare, right? Who lived how many years ago? And I can't interview Shakespeare, obviously, right? So that was really liberating in a lot of ways. And so just to kind of show another picture here, again, this is Jessica Perez Jackson. Her poem can be found in Storyboard 13. Corey Santos, his poem can be found in Local Voices Anthology, which is available at the University of Guam Press. And Lehua Taitano, her poems in her poetry book, A Bell Made of Stones, which can be found on Tinfish Press. And if anyone needs more information on how to get a hold of these poems, feel free to reach out and let me know. I'd love to share. And so after reading their poems, reading their stories that they had written and published, again, because I'm Chamaole and I've written about my experiences, I knew that there's more, right? You can only fit so much of your story on a white page. And so I wanted to interview them. And it was really great. I got to meet with Jessica over coffee, meet with Corey over coffee. I got to telephone with Lehua. She was in Santa Rosa, California at the time. And that truly was the best part of this project, was just being able to connect with them as people, like not just reading their poetry, but hearing their voice and hearing their story and really hearing the emotion, right? Coming from within them, as we talked about some of our shared experiences. And so the outcome of my project, what identities do Chamaoles inhabit simultaneously? So number one, for all the people in my research, Jessica, Corey, Lehua, and myself, we all self-identify as Chamorro. I know that in this project, I use the word Chamaole a lot, but as I'll talk about later, really internally, our home culture and our home identity and the identity that we grew up with is Chamorro identity. And so here are just some snippets from interviews, right? Jessica, she said she identifies more with being Chamorro, right? But she understands a little bit of her Haole side in these small cultural experiences, like corned beef and cabbage. But being Chamorro is where her heart really is. Same with Corey. He says, I'm Chamaole by blood, right? He's Chamorro and white American ancestrally, genealogically, but his culture was dominantly Chamorro. So in that regard, he says he's 100% Chamorro. Same with Lehua. When people ask me, I will say I am Chamorro as a subtext, or like a less important detail, right? Lehua will say she's white. The fact that came after having a revelation of Chamorros not seeing me as being Chamorro. And what I love about what Lehua says here is, for me and for these poets, I would say, like, as children, we thought we were just Chamorro, grew up in a Chamorro home, practiced the Chamorro language, did Chamorro things, and didn't realize maybe until middle school, later in elementary school, that some people see us and think like, hey, there's that, that white kid, they're probably in the military, or their parents are probably in the military. And so as far as like what identities Chamaoles inhabit, we know that ancestrally, they come from Chamorros and they come from white Americans, which can be so many different ethnicities. You can be Irish American, German American, but culturally and home identity wise, these people, they're very rooted here in this community. So my second research question, what identity encounters do Chamaoles face? Basically, what experiences do Chamaoles have? And so one shared experience by the Chamaoles in my project is what is called racial othering. And so what racial othering means is people in a community look at you, they see just your physical appearance, and they associate that appearance with an identity and with a whole different culture. And so racial othering, what I have to point out here is like, it's not always a clean cut, you know. I can walk into Barragata gas station and someone can say half a day, you know, they'll know I'm Chamorro, or they know I'm mixed. You know, they look at me and they're like, oh yeah, you know, she looks like she could be Chamorro. But, you know, sometimes I can walk into Jigo McDonald's and someone will say, oh, hey ma'am, are you in the military? Are you just coming from Anderson? I'm like, no, I'm from Agate, you know? So racial othering, it's definitely an experience that I'll talk about more later, but for now, just coming from the interviews. So like Jessica, she said her nickname was 75 cents, right? And people would call her Hallie, like, hey, Hallie, Hallie, Hallie. And this is funny because, like, if, you know, again, race is physical, right? And for Jessica, it was also her last name, right? And so Jessica, I think so it's like it varies from person. Like I can look at Jessica and think, oh, she looks Chamorro, but someone else might say, oh, she looks Hallie. And so something to think about. And then for Corey, in the 5th grade, Corey shared that 5th grade was when someone called him a white boy. And growing up in Guam, and maybe it's the same in the Northern Marianas, you know, it's like being called a white boy or a white girl and feeling Chamorro, you're just like, what, me? And in this experience, it was very violent for Corey because he was being physically picked on for looking a certain way. And lastly, Lehua, she shared an experience at her family party, and an uncle called her Chamaole. Her mom would use the word half-caste, and Lehua says she's not gonna call herself these things. And so what I really want to convey here is the discomfort and the just how like these people, they shared that these were very uncomfortable experiences. For me personally, I write in my thesis, I write about being in the 5th grade and being pushed by some random kid who said, get out of my way, Hallie, you know? And at the time, it was something I really wrestled with, just like my participants. And so race is something that seems ordinary or normal, but it's really socially created. So we create these patterns and we create these associations like, okay, she has really light skin, her hair is lighter brown, that must mean she's in the military, or that must mean she's from the States. Likewise, you know, if, oh, her skin is really dark, or her eyes look this way, her lips look this way, her hair is this texture, she must be, you know, I'll go down the list of identities. She must be from this island or this country, this village, you know, it's, and so the key lesson I want to share is that we can't depend on race. We cannot depend on physical features to tell us who a person is, to tell us where they come from, what their home culture is, what their identity is. And we need to really treat it with care. When we go into our communities in Guam and the Marianas, and we come across people, we need to really think, like, how am I reacting to the way this person looks? And not like how they're dressed, but their physical appearances. Am I treating them differently? am I assuming that they're from a certain place? And so another important thing that I want to really share is that as Chamaoles, you know, we did all share experiences being picked on, right? Or teased, or racially othered for being white. But despite that, we also recognize that having some of our white features comes with some privileges. You know, if I walk into a government building, I'm going to be treated differently, probably, from someone else in my family. Let's say my great-grandmother, trying to file for like reparations, right? World War II reparations. Like speaking in English and having white skin can give you this kind of social mobility that some of our darker skinned relatives don't have access to, and our friends in our community. And I can talk more about that another time. And so another shared experience here is incongruence, or that clash that Chamaoles experience, and a pain threshold. These are just fancy words that mean confusion and pain, basically. And so Jessica shared, you know, as a child, even though she knew being called 75 cents was a term of endearment, it was still painful to be called that. She said, I'm not even full Hallie, I'm only a quarter. And they're like, nah, you're 75 cents. Same with Corey. Corey described like being called a white boy, it did something visceral, like physically, he felt something in him snap and he got really angry. Same with Lehua, she felt really insulted. And she says it was the first time she felt she was not Chamorro. And it was something deep down that hurt when her uncle called her Chamaole and it wasn't something she identified with. And so the point that I'm really trying to share in this section is sense of belonging to community, belonging to our island home. And so being a mixed race Chamorro, when someone tells you you're not Chamorro, it can be very painful because you end up just asking, well, what else would I be? I'm born here, I'm raised here. My mom is Chamorro, or my dad is Chamorro. And so the main argument that I want to bring and hopefully share is that you can be multiracial, multicultural, but if you're born and raised in the Chamorro culture, then you belong. And so reading their poems and doing this project was what taught me that it's really important that we share as much as possible to our younger generation of Chamorros, that especially in an increasingly, times with more intermarriages and Chamorros who live away from home, like it's important for us to let them know, like, you're not any less Chamorro. You're just as Chamorro as the rest of us. And we might experience the world in different ways because of our appearance, which I can, again, talk more about later. But in our hearts, we share this community. And so that's really the central purpose of this project. Which ties into my third question. What strategies, what tools can help Chamaoles construct their identities in psychologically positive ways? And so one way was speaking identity using the Chamorro language. This was a really fun theme that came up in my project. The title of my project, right, is called Pakaka Pachot-mu, which I'm thankful you're all still here listening. For those of us who do speak Chamorro, that's not a very nice phrase to say. It translates to close your mouth, or more emotionally correct, like shut your mouth. And the reason why I made that my title is because that's always been the tool in a community of Chamorros to kind of let them know, like, hey, I'm not Haole, like, I'm one of you guys. And that's an experience that Jessica, Corey especially, and to some extent Lehua shared, is speaking the Chamorro language is part of who they are. And really, like, you can tell someone, I'm from Agate, I'm a Taitano, I'm a Sablan, and they'll be like, yeah, okay. But if you say Gihagetsu, you know, like, I'm from Agate, you know, how are you doing today? Or Pachot-mu, you know, Tihaolezu, then they're gonna be like, okay, this person is one of us, right? And the point I'm getting at here is, it was a nice trend to see from my participants that they're trying to use the Chamorro language as much as possible, right? We come from this history, and to be Chamaole, what I think is unique compared to other mixed race identities in the Marianas, white American identity is still a part of our bloodline, is still a part of our genealogy. And for many of us, I know on my mom's side, and for Lehua, there are families with a white American Chamorro father and a Chamorro mother. And for Lehua, she shared that her father made her stop speaking Chamorro. On my mom's side of the family, my great-grandfather, he didn't want the kids to speak Chamorro to him. And so there are some echoes of that colonial violence, right? American education telling us that we can't speak Chamorro in schools. And so that resistance or that healing through learning the Chamorro language is part of the healing process for these participants. So another tool, along with learning our home languages, is using the third space, and having the third space, recognizing that it's not just a Chamorro world, it's not just a Haole world, it's not just these two cultures that are at each other's throats, but there's actually this space in between. And it's not, growing up, I would think that it's a sense of not belonging. Oh, I don't belong in either. I don't look Chamorro enough. I don't look white enough. I don't speak Chamorro good enough. I don't do enough American things. And so really what third space identity is, articulated by my participants, Jessica says she thinks there's benefits to being Chamaole, to being mixed. She says, because I occupy that space, I can see both perspectives of all these interactions. Corey, he says he's a Haole, but he's not, pardon the language on the screen, but he's not what we call the ugly American, which I can talk about another time, which is I think nowadays the kids call it being a Karen. So yeah, and then Lehua says, I am not just existing in spite of, I'm allowing myself to exist as I am. And so, again, going back to third space, this tool or this strategy of thinking is for anyone who's mixed race, mixed culture, multicultural. It's really this way of thinking that's like, hey, you know, it's okay, like, I can own it, right? I don't have to feel, I mean, it's okay to feel a certain way, but I don't need to believe people who tell me I don't belong somewhere culturally, when I know that it's my cultural home. And I can actually learn a lot from these different perspectives and experiences that I have. And so what I found to be the most impactful for the findings in my project, again, just one more time to recap, is being Chamaole from Guam specifically, people's experiences are going to be different. Like the experiences of these poets and myself, it's not going to be, not every Chamaole is going to experience life the way we did with our identity. But what's impactful, I think, is this knowing that the community, there is a community here. There are, not just these poets, but we have a really vast mixed culture and mixed race community in Guam and in the Marianas. And this can hopefully be a platform where we can start asking these questions and start learning more and really recognizing that Chamorros look different, right? We can't move forward with the idea that all Chamorros look the same or have the same genealogy, because we don't. Lastly, just for future research, comments on future research for this project. So personally, I'm really excited that this presentation today is out of the Northern Marianas Humanities Council. I really wanted to do some research, collect some narratives from Saipan, Lutza, Tinian about being mixed race Chamorro, but there's only so many pages of the master's thesis. And if there's anyone tuning in who has experiences specifically from other Mariana Islands, right, not just Guam, I think that representation is super important. And speaking of representation, a really big limitation in my research is the mixed race Chamorro identities I'm talking about are Chamorro and white identities. And so the issue with that is being white and in having a white identity, we see whiteness in so much media representation. From Barbie, right? The white skin, light hair, blue eyes. We see these as desired physical traits to have, despite being in a Chamorro community. And so I really look forward to future mixed race Chamorro projects coming out that touch on non-white identities. I have to give a shout out to Kiana Brown, a really amazing colleague and friend of mine. She has an upcoming thesis presentation on Black Chamorro narratives, and I think that's going to be a phenomenal project, and I'm super proud of the work that she's doing, because again, the way a Chamaole experiences race in Guam and the Marianas is very different from how a Black Chamorro, Chamarita, or a young man would experience race and identity. And these are, again, places in conversation that I hope will take off and that anyone would like to ask questions about. And so I will go ahead and wrap up there and see if there are any questions. So thank you so much, all of you, for listening in. If there's anything I mentioned that you want to ask more about, please feel free to ask me anytime. I'm happy to share. This is Masi.
Hi, Ariel. Thank you so much for that presentation. I am already seeing some questions populate the chat. So we have one here from Leo Pangolin. He says, thank you so much for sharing these stories and the personal adversity you and other Chamaoles face to feel secure in their sense of belonging to these islands and Chamorro community. Thinking about my own personal experiences as someone who is mixed white and Chamorro, I wonder how much of the so-called hate speech directed toward Chamaoles are rooted in resentment, envy, or fear in the context of Chamorro experiences with white privilege and power as expressed in the media and colonization. Any thoughts on this?
Yes, absolutely. I love this question. So, yeah, I mean, one of the findings in my project that I didn't get to share actually is there are reasons for this. There's a reason why Chamorros, might look at a white body like mine and feel a certain way, feel antagonistic, feel worried. And so I actually define Haole in my project, like in Chamorro consciousness, to be like that Haole, that rude Haole, so to say, is to have a certain set of attitudes. And as Chamorros, we've heard this narrative. We've heard white Americans, and obviously not every white American, but in Guam, a lot of that presence, we've had educators who are largely white telling Chamorros, you can't speak your language. People, military personnel who were often white, saying things like, this island is so backwards, like, you people need to develop, or like, you all just join the military to mooch off of our commissary services. And it's these are real attitudes that exist. And I feel like because I'm Chamaole, and because I also inhabit that white identity, that I can confidently speak towards it, and I can say it's a cultural issue. We look at the United States right now, and there's this culture of individualism that's really kind of running rampant, right? And so there's always this space in between. So it's true that these emotions are coming from a history of oppression, but at the same time, we have to keep in mind that these are still Chamorro people. Like, these Chamorros, they didn't choose for one of their parents to be white American, or choose for one of their grandparents to be white American. It's just the cards that they were dealt with, so to say. And so we can't treat every white body in Guam and the Marianas as an aggressive military presence, that we've done historically. So I do really appreciate that question. And the last thing I will say about white privilege, it exists, for sure. When we talk about access to resources, access to land, when we think about socioeconomics, most Haoles on Guam are moved either because they're in the military, or because they're working on these big projects like engineering, these really like high paying jobs that pay for them to move to Guam. And so there's a reason why there's definitely a difference in access to resources. Thank you. I'll stop there.
We have another question here from Isa Areola. She says, Hafa de Ariel, thank you for this wonderful presentation. It takes a lot of courage to talk about these stories, and something I never would have heard about when I was young growing up on Saipan. So bravo. I had a question/comment that is connected to what you expressed at the end of the presentation. I find it interesting that out here in the CNMI and on Guam, we automatically map whiteness onto the term American, of course because of our colonial experiences. Have you come across other ways that people describe their non-white and Chamorro identities on Guam? Out here we have Chamolinian, Chamorro plus Carolinian, Chamalawan, Chamorro plus Palawan, Chamawayan, Chamorro plus Hawaiian, Chamirish, Chamerican, etc. Sizus Maasi.
That is beautiful. So the first, there was two parts to that question, I think. For the second part, do we have other names? I've heard Chamawayan. I've seen families use Hafa Aloha, like Hafa Day and Aloha, for mixed Chamorro Hawaiian families, for non-white families. Chamorro Chukis. I heard some really cool, I can't think of it right now, but there was a very cool word that the community used for mixed race and culture, mixed identity Chamorro Chukis. Yeah, thank you for that. I never heard Chamerican, but that's great. I might start using that. And yes, the earlier question was about white American bodies. So I did realize in my research, or came across in my research, because I was like, hey, you know, we use haole for white Americans, right? But like if we have a Russian tourist, we don't call them haole. And I really wondered about that. And I actually read a text by Laurel and Monig that pointed out like, okay, in Guam, haole is specifically for someone who's white from America, at least the way it's used today. And then, you know, we just call them, oh, the Russians or the Germans. We don't have a lot of exposure really in Guam to a lot of white ethnicities other than American and Russian, I have to say, which is part of the unique experience of studying race in the Marianas, is we kind of deal with what we're exposed to. So thank you for that.
Andrew Roberto asks, how does the mestizo identity shift based on the culture of the mother?
You know, someone asked me this question before as well. And while looking at my research, my participants, I mean, more research would have to be done, but it seems like it doesn't really play, it may or may not play a central role. So for me, both of my parents are Chamaole. For Lehua, her mom is Chamorro. For Jessica, it's her grandpa who's haole. I think Corey's story is relevant to this question. So Corey's mom is haole, and his dad is Chamorro, and his experience was still very similar to mine. And it could be, I mean, he was saying his mom just loves the culture here, wanted to stay in Guam and live in Guam. So it could generally be the family dynamic. Gender is definitely plays a role. I didn't have enough time for this project to focus on gender, but it would be great if there's anyone tuning into this that is into gender studies and wanted to approach research like this through a gendered lens. I feel like that would be very fruitful. Because we do also see, right, like in Lehua's case, like her mom being Chamorro and her father being white American, kind of asserting this patriarchal demand, right? Like, no, my daughter's not going to speak Chamorro anymore. And that's not Chamorro culture, right? In Chamorro culture, we don't let a man tell us what to do. I'm just kidding. Chamorro culture is largely matrilineal. So marrying out of the culture can definitely influence the way that children are raised, right? I think interracial, intercultural marriages, there has to be a lot of negotiation about, okay, culturally, what are we going to do with our kids for this aspect? And it seems for all of us, all four of us in my project, maybe we had, you know, some white American or haole relative, but culturally we were raised to be really attached to our Chamorro home and our Chamorro culture. Really great question. Thank you, Andrew.
Just something to note, we do have an attendee who wanted to know how she could get in touch with you. Do you have your contact info? Like, how can people reach out to you to talk more about this?
Okay, so I'm pretty active on my Instagram account. You can also contact me via email. I don't know, is it possible, Sophie? Can they email you or someone on the council?
Absolutely, yeah. I'll post my email right here. I actually have a quick question for you, Ariel. I was really interested in your presentation. There were a lot of aspects of like how Chamorro family members responded to like the mixed ethnicities of the Chamaoles. I was wondering, did you collect any info about how the white side of the family responded to Chamaole's Chamorro sides?
Thank you for that question. So actually, what I found interesting, like for me, I have no connection to my white family actually. So like all of my white grandparents and great grandparents, they really just kind of disconnected from their families when they moved to Guam. So I never got to experience that. For my participants, it wasn't one of my research questions, that's for sure. But I think it was something I was thinking about a lot. So like my last name is Lowe, and I still have a whole family of Lowes in Ohio and Kentucky that I haven't met yet. My grandpa's sisters and their children, and so I wouldn't know how they would interact with Chamorro culture. The closest I can come to that, I think, is going to the States or being in the States is really interesting as a Chamorro, and I think it's a shared experience. Hearing a lot of narratives like, where is Guam? You know, you look so exotic, you know, that kind of thing. You have so much color. Like, so many people I came across told me that in the States, and I'm just like, I never hear that back home. I hear something completely different, which is again part of the experience. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that. If anyone has any other questions, please do post them in the chat. We're getting towards the end of the hour. In the meantime, Ariel, is there anything that you'd like to add or that you'd like to just share to our audience?
I think I would just like to just mention one more time that these experiences, they're so rich, you know, and I'm actually hoping to work with Northern Marianas Humanities and some other colleagues to maybe do some writing workshops in the future. We'd love to collect, you know, like hear more stories or help elevate voices of those who are not yet represented, right, in the literature. Just like one of our participants asked earlier about Chamaolayan narratives, Chamawayan narratives from the Northern Marianas, Chamorro Chuukese narratives. My friend I mentioned, Kiana Brown, who's coming up with a Black Chamorro Narratives project, I believe in November or December, she'll be sharing that information. And so just my last thing is, if you have a story that you want to share, you can always share it with me if you want to, or share it with someone you trust. And I just really want to encourage those who want to write their stories and share their stories to do so, and that there's a loving community waiting for them.
Thank you for that. That's really sweet. Actually, one more question just came in. Given Guam is a colony of the United States, would you say there is a racial hierarchy similar to the Spanish era in terms of access to wealth and privilege? And if so, where does the Chamaole fit into this paradigm?
Wonderful. So this topic was touched on in my research, and I see potential for more research to be done on it. Right now, I would definitely say there is a correlation to whiteness and access to resources in Guam and access to privilege. And I can only speak from my own experience. So, you know, my grandma, right? My grandma, Aurora Savon, she married my grandfather, Gordon Lowe, who at the time was in the US Navy. And this was probably in maybe the 50s, Guam in the 50s. And to be a Chamorro woman on Guam in the 50s and choose to marry a Haole, a white American serviceman, even if it's out of love, it comes with access to economic resources. We see it all the time. We see that, most of the military service members on Guam are, who are not Chamorro. It's like Chamorros and then white. It's like the next dominant ethnicity in the military community on Guam with, big housing allowance, access to land, all of this stuff. And so Chamaole, to be Chamaole, is definitely to recognize that disparity. For me to realize, like, hey, if my grandma didn't marry the white Navy sailor, where would my family be economically? Would my grandma have been able to raise all 7 of her kids to be educated Western education? Would she have been able to send her kids off to college if she didn't marry someone in the Navy in the 50s? Like, we have to think about relationships to income and access to land. And so in that sense, Chamaoles have the same task that all Haoles have, which is to acknowledge white privilege and to really be an ally when we see it happening on all levels. Walking into a store and seeing that you're treated way differently from like, your Chuki's friend, or like the Chuki's woman who came in after you, and the store clerk is not even talking to them. You're just like, you just gave me like a 5-minute speech on this, and this, and then you just told her to wait outside. Why did you do that? We have this responsibility to call out these privileges and to try to dismantle them. And same, right? I see other people in my community doing work with race and culture and ethnicity, and I can recognize there are more Chamaole stories written and published. And if we look deep enough, that's probably correlation between wealth, resources, access to higher education and writing and publishing opportunities compared to mixed Chamorros who are not white. And so my responsibility then is to help nurture and just like really encourage in any facility I can for non-white narratives to find, a place in our Chamorro story, in our Chamorro literature, because whiteness has been at the center of too many things for too long.
Well, Ariel, this has been such a fascinating and important presentation. I just want to say thank you so much for coming forward and talking about this often difficult subject. And also I want to remind our attendees that my email, sophia@nmhcouncil.org, is posted in the chat. If you'd like to reach Ariel, you're welcome to reach out through me or find her on Instagram. We have also another webinar at 5 p.m. featuring Lenny Leon. Please tune in if you're interested in hearing about his experience documenting Typhoon U2 through photography. And yeah, I think that basically covers it. Thank you again, Ariel. Really, it's been such a valuable hour and really appreciate your work.
I'm so glad.
Have a great rest of your day, everyone. Thank you for attending.
Thank you.